What's up guys, welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be going over some of the macros that I like to use in PvP. Well, none of these macros are mandatory, they definitely do make my life easier and hopefully you'll find some of them useful. Anyway, let's get straight into that. As you've probably noticed, I like to have a lot of my action bars hidden so that I can have more peripheral vision and I can see more of what's going on my screen. So I prefer to condense several of my buttons down into modifier macros, where, for example, my eviscerate key here, number 5, if I have eviscerate just selected, no modifiers, it'll just use eviscerate. If I hold down Alt, it'll change to thistle, which restores 100 energy. It's just an item you can get in the class hall, and I just use it in Battlegrounds and World PvP. And if I hold Shift, it would be Death from Above, which I don't currently have selected here, but as soon as I pick Death from Above, I don't have to drag it to my bar, it's just automatically there. The other variation of this macro I use is with my human racial, and which is also cold blood in a PvP setting. So I have a few macros which I will show on screen here, and I will also leave in the description below, in which you hold down Shift and it uses one ability, you hold down Alt, it uses another ability, and if you hold down no modifiers, it will just use whichever ability you have selected there. Also, for any new players, it's good to note that when using these macros, since you have to hold down Alt and Shift, it doesn't already take into account that you may not have that keybound. So if you hit Escape, open up the game menu, and go to Keybindings, you can just do things like bind. For me, it'd be keybind 5, so Shift 5 if I bind that, and then just click Unbind Key, then nothing will be bound to that, and you can ensure that your macro will then work properly. Because if you do have Shift 5, for example, bound to something, then the Shift modifier on this macro for my 5 keybind just won't work. These particular macros are only really useful when you're trying to save bar space. I like to see the cooldowns of multiple abilities that don't all fit onto my bars, and you could argue I can hide stuff like Gloomblade and whatever, but the reason I don't like to hide Gloomblade and other abilities that have no cooldowns is because I subliminally use that to keep track of my energy. I'm not always looking up at my health bar, so having that extra way to track my energy while I'm looking around the screen to see what's going on in the game is really useful. The next kind of macro I like to use is a modifier focus macro, and what that means is if I cast my kick, for example, this one is written for kick. If I cast kick, I just press down F, that is my kick keybind. If I just press F, it'll kick my target, and if I hold down Shift, it will kick at my focus target. So if I have, basically, if I was targeting this fairy dragon and I was targeting myself and I held down Shift F, it would kick the fairy dragon instead of me. And the reason that's useful is because that gives you access to essentially targeting 2 targets at the same time, depending on which keybind you're holding. You can set up this macro for all kinds of abilities. You can do it for a cheap shot, you can do it for blind. I have one for blind as well. You can also use it for kidney shot, shiv, sap, the list goes on. You can use it for anything. It's just a great macro to have. It allows you to have a lot more control over your gameplay, and I would highly recommend using focus macros. Also, alternatively to this, you do not have to use a focus macro. You can simply go into interface and you go to game, down to combat, and there is a focus cast key option, and you can simply set this to Shift or Alt or whichever you prefer. The downside is you need to make sure whichever keybind you are trying to use through this method is not bound in the interface somewhere, or it will not work. So just make sure, like for example when I showed you the Shift 5 thing, that Shift 5 in this sense isn't keybound, and you will be totally fine. Sometimes you may not want to use a Shift modifier for focus. You may just want to set an alternate keybind, and that's the case for me with Shoutstep, and it's just simply hashtag show tooltip /cast target equals focus Shoutstep, and that just simply Shadowsteps my focus target. Pretty straightforward. The next kind of macro I like to use is for shuriken toss, and it's a mouseover shuriken toss macro. So what that does for me is, say I'm targeting this big guy here, and I mouse over this little guy, and I hit my shuriken toss keybind, it'll throw it at him without even untargeting this big guy. And the reason why this is useful is because you can use it to whack low health totems or keep players in combat. and it can be very, very useful in a tight situation when you need to, say, keep a rogue in combat right before he's able to re-stealth, or even if he gets off that stealth, you'll bring him out if you hit him with this. And so it's just another one of the many small uses of shuriken toss, and I would highly recommend having the mouseover option. However, it's not mandatory. Also good to note that you can use the same exact macro for poison knife if you're playing assassination. Lastly, the macros that make me kind of a weird player is when I use Shadow Dance, something different happens. So normally when you press Shadow Dance, your stealth bar will come up and it'll show you your stealth bar abilities, which is totally fine under normal circumstances. But a long time ago, back in Wrath of the Lich King and Cataclysm, when you use Shadow Dance, you would have its own dedicated bar. And so you would have a bar that was entirely only there during Shadow Dance. And the reason why this was a big deal to me is when I Shadow Dance, I preferred to have my ambush on 2. And when I'm in stealth, you'll see that my cheap shot is actually on 2. So when they merged this a long time ago, that really threw me off, and I needed to find a workaround. So what I do is when I press Shadow Dance, my bar pages over to a second action bar that's normally hidden. You don't use it for anything else. And that has all of my abilities on there, but instead of having my extra Gloomblade Keybind, which I don't need, the only reason I have that is because I formerly had Hemorrhage when we had that back in the day. Instead of that being there, I have Sap. And other than that, it's set up like my regular bar. So you might be wondering, where's my cheap shot during Shadow Dance? And the answer is in a macro hidden on my sidebars. And I'll show you those macros in a second here. Basically, in the macro book, I have macros that allow me to use Shadow Dance and Symbols of Death together, and they also page over to the second action bar. So for example, my big burst macro is /use13, which just pops your top trinket slot on use trinket, which doesn't matter in arena. It only matters in world PvP situations and other outdoor duels and stuff. And then it changes /changeactionbar 2. It changes over to that second page when I press it, and then it activates Shadow Dance and Symbols of Death. I also, in addition to this macro, use one that is just Shadow Dance and changes my action bar over. And if you're going to make macros to combine Shadow Dance and Symbols of Death, for example, make sure you have access to using Shadow Dance separate and Symbols of Death separate, because you should always have access to each of your individual abilities, and you shouldn't rely on just pressing one macro to use all of your abilities, for example, because there are many situations when you don't want to use your Symbols of Death and Shadow Dance at the same time. If I just want to Shadow Dance to peel somebody with a cheap shot real quick, there's no need to waste my Symbols of Death damage increase for that. Next is my Shadow Dance cheap shot macro. I also have these macros for Sap. I have regular target and focus target variations of this macro, and what it does is it will pop Shadow Dance only if it is not active, meaning that if I spam this button over and over and over again, if Shadow Dance is active, it won't reactivate Shadow Dance and waste extra Shadow Dance charges. Instead, it just pages over to that second action bar with /changeactionbar 2, which that is my dance bar. You don't need that if you want to use your stealth bar still. That's totally fine. And then it will use cheap shot if I'm in stealth or if I'm Shadow Dancing. And the reason I like to use this macro is because there is a small bar delay when you go from out of stealth into stealth, and in this case, out of stealth into Shadow Dancing, and that is something you don't want to deal with. It's just a lot faster if you use this macro to get your cheap shot off immediately after hitting Shadow Dance, and it will allow you to do a lot more things, such as very quickly react to another player's trinket with a quick cheap shot, or sometimes even a sap, depending on the situation. I highly recommend this macro, and it is very useful. Once again, you don't need the /changeactionbar 2 if you do not plan to use the alternate action bar like I do, and you just wish to use your stealth bar. Also, it's good to note that I obviously have to switch my action bar back after Shadow Dance ends, since it is not an automated feature like your stealth bar, which is the other reason why I don't really recommend doing this method. However, if you're someone who played back in Wrath of the Lich King and you're just coming into this expansion now, you may want to consider doing this, although it will be a little weird to get used to at first. Also, before I go, I created this one-shot macro for any new players who are just looking to have some fun. I really don't recommend using this macro at all, but it can be fun to mess around with. Basically, you just go up to the target and you beat the shit out of the keybind, and it'll do the rotation for you. It can be somewhat fun. And yeah, hopefully you'll have some fun with that. I discluded shadow blades from this macro as well, just so you can increase the frequency of using this macro. Reason being, if a certain ability is on cooldown that is written in this macro, like if Shadow Dance is on cooldown, when the macro gets to Shadow Dance, if it's not available, your macro will stop working. So that's also why the reset is in there, because after 5 seconds of not hitting this macro at all, it'll reset to the start of its rotation. And yeah, so hopefully you have some fun with that. Anyway, as always, like, comment, subscribe for more. I hope this video was useful, and I will see you all again very soon.